Today's show is sponsored by Okta, the leading independent identity solution. Okta provides best-in-class authorization so your customers and workforce can safely access what they need most right when they need it from anywhere. Organizations around the world trust Okta's Identity Cloud to sign in, authorize, and manage users, whether it's employees, contractors, partners, or customers. And with Okta's developer tools, you'll never have to build authentication again. Our customizable code blocks are flexible and future-proof with easy-to-use APIs and SDKs, so you can do less coding and more shipping. Okta is dedicated to building the most reliable, neutral identity platform because it means protecting more than a login. Identity is protecting people, their ideas, their work, their brilliance. It's protecting your future with confidence. Learn more at okta.com. That's OKTA.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well as we continue into April of 2021. If my voice sounds a little bit hoarse, it's because this could be called the pollen cast. If you're living here in the southern part of the United States, it is pollen central. It's basically like a giant yellow fog. Happens every time about this time of year, and it affects me like nobody's business. So I'm just trying to get through the show without sneezing, without coughing. So hopefully we can do that. Let's jump right into Cloud News of the Week so we can avoid some of that coughing and sneezing. Kind of an odd week. Lots of news, but not the normal kind that we tend to have, which is, acquisitions and funding and other things like that, mergers. This week was a lot of just sort of random stuff. First up is the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Google in their case, longstanding case, with Oracle. Oracle had brought charges that Google had violated Java copyright APIs, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that was not the case, that Google was well within their right to re-implement an API that was, I guess they deemed open source. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to kind of try and explain what happened, but basically Google won, Oracle lost, and that's that. So next thing on the list was Azure, who had an outage of some of their major services, some of the live services, Xbox and so forth last week, came out with their postmortem. Folks are getting better at their postmortems when their cloud goes down. This one was DNS. It's always DNS. So, it's sort of like Groundhog's Day. It's always DNS or it's always the network, and in this case, it was DNS. Intel had a launch of their Ice Lake platform, their new chipset platform, 10 nanometer, going to improve performance 20%. So for those of you that like to follow hardware, I know there's been some news about Intel, both sort of positive and negative, new CEO, big investments they're making. Also, we've covered a little bit of the ARM stuff. We will be covering some of the new Intel stuff coming up pretty soon, so look forward to that. We'll dig into that a little bit more. I know some of you love the software and some of you love the hardware, so we will be digging into that space as well, kind of looking at where Intel's going. And then finally, we do a thing on Sundays we've done a few times, sort of lessons learned from some technologies that were big and sort of hot at one point in time, and then sort of faded away, and we've done some lessons learned. I don't know that we'll do a lessons learned from this one, although we may include it as part of something. The Mesos project, which was came out of, I can't believe it came out of Berkeley. I think it also came out of Twitter. Some work done there. Eventually became Mesosphere. A lot of, was its own Apache project, spawned things like Mesos and Marathon. So really kind of one of the original container orchestrators, was really, really focused around big data, did a lot of work around kind of establishing or creating some of the concepts that eventually got adopted by Kubernetes. So, some of the ideas of things like operators and, separating out the sort of low-level platform from the applications that run on top and things like that. But the Mesos project has basically said, hey, there's not enough activity with the maintainers, and we are essentially going to shelve the project. So RIP Mesos, pouring one out for you, kind of the OG of container schedulers, especially at scale. Didn't necessarily break out into great commercial success. Mesosphere was probably the primary company with that, eventually became 2IQ, day 2IQ, and eventually they sort of moved over and adopted Kubernetes and so forth. So pour one out for Mesos. Glad we knew you. You were around when Mesos and Swarm and Kubernetes were all talked about as the big three, trying to sort out who was going to win the container orchestration wars. So with that, we're going to wrap up. We're going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week. We're going to dig into some fun stuff, looking at kind of what it means to put together software supply chains and some of the tooling that goes along with that. So very excited to do that with some good folks from GitLab coming up right after the break.
Today's show is sponsored by O'Reilly. O'Reilly is known for its animal books, which have helped tech professionals stay ahead for over 40 years. Today, its online learning platform at O'Reilly.com takes learning tech to the next level. Sure, your teams get access to thousands of books and videos, but there's also interactive learning, where they can get hands-on with tech like Kubernetes, Python, Docker, Java, and more in live dev environments. So they learn by doing, not just reading. With live online sessions, your teams learn from the biggest brains in AI, software architecture, cloud, data, programming, and more. They can even prep for tech certification exams with official materials and interactive practice tests. And then there's O'Reilly Answers. You just ask the search engine any tech question and it takes you right to the best answers from O'Reilly's renowned books. It's why 66% of all Fortune 100 companies give their teams O'Reilly Online Learning. Get a demo today at O'Reilly.com. That's O'Reilly.com.
Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and traces from technologies like Istio, AppMesh, and Envoy. Plus, Datadog's Service Map automatically plots out the dependencies in your microservices architectures for seamless, context-rich troubleshooting. With rich visualizations, algorithmic alerting, and more than 250 vendor-supported integrations, Datadog allows you to monitor your distributed applications in real time. Start a free 14-day trial today by visiting datadog.com/cloudcast, and Datadog will send you a great free t-shirt. That's datadog.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And folks, one of the things that we're always doing these days with shows is we find that so many topics tend to overlap. Sometimes we'll be talking about technology. It overlaps with sort of current trends that are going on or an event that went on. Sometimes it's DevOps and security. And so we blend things like DevSecOps and other stuff together. And, these days, more and more we're hearing about kind of how not only we build software and CI and CD, but, more so we're talking about software supply chains and kind of all the things that go into not only where does your raw material come from in terms of software, but how do we integrate third-party pieces of it? How do we know what's good, what's bad, and ultimately, how do we get this stuff into production? And that's a complicated thing. It's a complicated set of machines, systems, processes, people, and so forth. And we've never really dug into it kind of in that breadth and depth. And so we thought we'd really kind of, bring on someone to help us have a good perspective on all the things that need to go on to make that happen and do it successfully. So very, very excited to have with us today, Brendan O'Leary, who is not only part of the CNCF board for technology, but also senior developer evangelist at GitLab. So Brendan, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. Really happy to be here and get to chat about all these really important topics today. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I mentioned software supply chains in the opening. That's obviously been in the news quite a bit. People have heard about like the SolarWinds hack, and we'll get into that stuff. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about your background. You have covered and worked on a lot of different things, but give folks some of your background and then what ultimately brought you to being, kind of passionate about this developer productivity space.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, I've spent most of my career in software. I kind of started in, your traditional IT when I was younger and break fix and all that good stuff, server maintenance, but got into software pretty early. I spent a long part of my career in actually medical software, which is like kind of an interesting vertical when it comes to software. You kind of have to be right. Like you don't get to be wrong in that space. We were specifically looking at radiology and women's imaging. So we were working with breast cancer detection and all of that. So it was, pretty high stakes kind of software environment. And then I swung the other way. That's still high stakes, and I worked for a government contractor to the U.S. Department of Defense for some time, and got to see kind of the scale of a massive enterprise, one of the largest enterprises on the planet, try to deploy and be consistent about deploying software. That was really interesting. And kind of my whole career I'd spent in engineering management and product management. And I'd always been thinking about, developer productivity and what it meant. The story that I tell here is when I was at that healthcare software company, I was walking from the CEO's office back to my office, and down that hall, the server room's on the way, and the server room door was open. Which is like never a good sign. Like the server room door is propped open. And in there, as I look to my left, is one of my most senior developers, and he has a server on his lap with a screwdriver in it. And that server happened to be the Redmine server, for those that remember Redmine. And that's where all the issues were stored that we were working on. And it went down, and he didn't know what to do next, so he started fixing the server. And that's when I kind of realized that developer tooling is something we kind of were taking for granted up until that point, but is really critical, because what I wanted him to be doing was spending time on, our cancer software, not on a screwdriver and a server, and so that got me really interested in that space. And I got lucky enough to then join GitLab, who we think about that all the time: developer productivity, how DevOps teams can really work to deploy better software faster. And so I've been really privileged for the past 3 years to work at GitLab, where I get to think about this all the time and see people do it across every industry. So it's really been great.
Yeah, no, that's very, very cool. It's everybody who's been around this industry for a little while has one of those stories where you see the thing where you're like, oh my God, that how did that happen? Mine was years ago. I worked at Cisco. We had this huge lab that we all used for testing stuff out and recreations, and one morning we all walked in on a Monday and all the cables were unplugged. And the story was basically somebody was in there on a Sunday. They were trying to recreate something. They couldn't get it to work, and then they couldn't figure out which cable was which, and they just started pulling them all out. And you're just like, I don't know how we would ever
Yep.
But yeah, the stuff that you could never imagine sometimes happens like that. So we live in an interesting industry. Let's talk about sort of, I'll call it the state of developer productivity in 2021. Like, you get a chance to talk to a lot of developers. You also get a chance to see kind of the systems that they have to work with, both good and bad. What do you see that people tend to do well these days? Like sort of how have they evolved things that work well? And then what are still the biggest bottlenecks that they run into?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think really, Brian, where we've gone as an industry is we've gotten a lot better about that. And I think that, back when I tell that screwdriver story, right? Like we had a Redmine server, we had an SVN server, we had some SVN, some Git, and we had a whole bunch of other, tools that we were using. And again, we were maintaining those tools and spending a lot of undifferentiated time from our developer teams really on doing that. And I think over the last, 10, maybe plus years, right, since we've had this kind of concept of DevOps, we've seen folks start to think about, the DevOps platform as a whole, right? It's not just an individual tool that does this one thing and it's completely separate from everything else. We've either seen, large enterprises spend time and effort in making their own DevOps platform out of those various tools. But at the same time, in the DevOps tools industry, we've seen consolidation where those tools are becoming one, right? And obviously that's kind of GitLab's take on the world, right? This single application across the entire DevOps lifecycle, because there's a lot of benefits to that. Right? We want to really realize the promise of DevOps in, hey, this means everyone needs to be working together from the same, sheet of music, if you will.
Right.
And so I think that move towards DevOps platform has been something that has been rather universal. Again, at large enterprises, that often takes the shape of like a tools team who is dedicated to building a platform that everyone else can use. And in small organizations, and then increasingly in larger organizations, we're seeing, a lot of that be farmed out as there's consolidation in industry. And I think the second part of your question was, well, what are we not good at? I think, when it comes to integrating security into that same thing, That's what's still really lacking, right? It's like 10 years ago, it was, well, maybe we have CI/CD integrated. I don't know. Right nowadays, that's kind of table stakes, right? You've got to have the CI/CD integrated with your code base and have that kind of seamless. And again, not everybody has it, but I think everybody knows they need it. And most folks do have it probably. But when it comes to bringing security into that same process, I think there's still a lot of opportunity to be had.
Yeah, I would agree. Security is kind of that funny thing that you're never really sure if, and it always depends from company to company. Like, is it viewed as more of an application thing? Is it viewed as more of a platform thing? And kind of depending on where the perspective is on that, it kind of dictates whether or not you get good hygiene or sort of this throw it over the wall, include them at the end type of thing. So yeah, I would completely agree with that. The other thing you mentioned I thought was really interesting was, your focus is on application teams. I think application teams have this sort of natural bias to be like, how do I get rid of work that slows me down, right? Like it's kind of an inherent thing that they are constantly thinking about. Whereas, and so, the GitLab platform, which is, brings together a bunch of capabilities that again are about, how do you take all this, cruft, if you will, that gets in the way of developers. And it's weird that we don't always see that necessarily like on lower level platforms. Like we still see lots of people that are trying to build their own Kubernetes platform, and the operations teams love the idea of like, hey, look at all these things I can put on my resume. It is very interesting to see the difference in mindset between app dev people and the way they value time and the operations teams and how they value time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And what, I think as enterprises and business leaders try to capture both, the energy that's in both of those mentalities, it's important. Like cycle time in my mind is the time to optimize for, right? Like the time that we can get something from being an idea to market. That's the competitive advantage, right? I talk about how, Mark Andreessen famously said, and it was almost a decade ago now, that software is eating the world. I think software's eaten the world, right? And your competitiveness is going to depend on your ability to deliver software faster. Like it just is. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Some maybe were changing faster than others. Well, then we have a global pandemic, and it's like everybody has to have an answer. I saw a funny meme on the internet early in that said, who was the driver of your digital or your DevOps transformation? Was it the CEO? Was it the CIO? Or was it COVID-19? I think we've really seen businesses have to pivot and be able to deliver better software faster in order to like compete in their industry, even if it's not a software industry.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. I'm curious, there's always this trade-off that people will say about, well, can we improve where we're at by applying better tools, or do we really have to sort of rethink how we're organized, or kind of what our processes? The answer is always somewhere in between there. But have you found kind of one approach versus the other, kind of tail wags the dog, or kind of one drags the other in better, or do you find we're still sort of not exactly sure if like the best way to fix this? Do we do it with technology? Do we do it with people, or is it 60-40, 70-30? How do you tend to see success in the market look like?
Sure, that's a great question, Brian. And I think, probably my CMO would want me to say, well, it's a tool, and you just go buy GitLab and it's all solved, right? But I mean, if we're being honest with each other, I think that's a 30% right part of the problem. Like, sure, your tools can greatly enable your ability to do this, bringing software to market faster. They can also greatly inhibit it, right? If you're spending a lot of cycles on those tools. But in the end, I think it's really a context switch of what are we optimizing for, right? And are we optimizing for each stage in the DevOps lifecycle? Like if I'm in security, I want to optimize for that stage. If I'm in operations, I want to optimize for that stage. And if I'm a developer, I want to optimize for my stage, right? That's this kind of disparate, not only disparate set of tools, but disparate set of, like you were saying, goals and what are the ways we measure success. I think the most critical part is having senior leadership very focused on, the criteria for success being ship better software faster. And we've seen even in data, right? If you look at the DORA data, right, out of the DevOps Research Institute, we've seen that faster doesn't mean less secure, and faster doesn't mean more problems. It's actually, that muscle of being able to deploy software consistently and quicker. Actually, you also builds the muscle of security and builds the muscle of changes that don't break production. Right? Those muscles get built when we're actually spending time focused on those very simplistic, well, seemingly simplistic, but can be very tricky metrics that focus on the end result rather than each piece of the pie.
Yeah. The DORA stuff is always really interesting. Obviously, Jez and Nicole do an awesome job with that stuff, but it's always an interesting report because I've always found it is the thing that if you really dive into it and you really understand it, it makes a ton of sense. And at the surface level, it always seems like the most counterintuitive thing that you've, to what the muscles that you built up, right? Like you said, more changes it creates better security. Going faster creates better flow. And it's a hard thing to kind of get past people if they're not willing to dive into it a little bit.
For sure. And I think it's, digging past the data to the more qualitative side, I don't think it's just necessarily, that one-to-one relationship. I think it's the attitude that causes each of those things come from the same attitude and the same focus on cycle time, the same focus on differentiated work, right? We want our teams doing differentiated work that benefits our customers, not undifferentiated heavy lifting that could be done everywhere. I think it's that focus, right? I don't think, if you just start deploying more often, you magically get security.
Right.
But I think if you focus on improving the process, right? This is something that we would have learned from manufacturing for years and years, right? We're going to focus on improving the process as a whole, and that's going to increase quality on, rolling off the end of the assembly line. And not that I think of software as an assembly line, but I think there's lessons to be learned there for sure. And I think that if you have to move faster, you then necessarily have to integrate security directly in, right? The story I tell from my time in government contracting was, super critical end user, right? This was, we were developing software for U.S. Special Operations Command, intelligence software. And so we do this in this massive, 8-wink product increments, right? Because we had all these teams involved, of course, contractors everywhere. And we get to the end and they'd be like, wait, who can run the security scans? Is it you? Is it who knows how to do that? Who's got the login? Right? And we'd go run the security scan and there'd be 175 things. And then we'd have this choice, this, for lack of a better analogy, a Sophie's choice of, do we deploy what the customer needs, knowing these things, or do we hold up another X, who knows, number of weeks to fix everything. Whereas each one of those things, if it came up when the developer was making the change, it could have been really obvious then to say, oh, you know what? I'm not doing this the right way. You're right. Let me fix it. Or, oh, this is definitely a false positive because X, Y, and Z, because we're in that mindset, right? We as developers, I'm a developer, amateur developer by choice, I would say. And when you're in that flow and you understand, you have the mental load of understanding how everything's interconnected and you're working on the specific section of code, that's when you want to hear about, hey, there might be an issue with this security thing, because that's when you can make a really smart decision about it or have a smart discussion with the security team about it. Versus if it's 3 weeks later, the developer's going to say, I don't think it's anything. I think it's a false positive. And the security person's going to say, oh, no, I'm really worried about this because X, Y, and Z. And to get to a common ground, you've got to go spend all this work again to get it reloaded into your own memory.
Yeah.
And figure it out.
I actually want you to put your GitLab CMO hat on a little bit. I'm curious. So GitLab does an awesome job of bringing together kind of all the pieces that you need from a supply chain perspective, a CI/CD perspective, and so forth. And again, the goal is always, look, if if your focus is on cycle time, on faster flows, the fact that we just happen to bring all these things together, we make it easier to use, it's a better UI, all these sort of things is awesome. How do you sort of counter the argument? And I don't mean this as a GitLab pitch, but like it's a common thing that people see. How do you sort of counter the argument where there's that loud voice in the room that goes, yeah, but what about my tool? Or I can't use this thing. Like, do you find that's something that you sort of counter with, well, let me show you a different way of thinking about it? Do you counter it with sort of numbers and statistics of like, hey, this is going to make you this much faster? Like, what are some of the ways? Because everybody runs into these situations where you're like, boy, I think we have this sort of better mousetrap, but there's this one squeaky wheel. Like how do you find sort of counter that to get people back to going, you're getting more value out of this than this one-off problem that you're bringing up?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And it's one that, like you said, we face a lot because the question is, hey, if we're going to have a single application, well, what about? And then insert, the tool from here and there. And I think there's two ways of looking at this. First, we have this extremely transparent company, and I think one thing that can help people is to understand the story of how we got there, and we're really transparent about it. And where that is we had GitLab, right? And GitLab, of course, started with Git and was all about source code management. And Dimitri, our co-founder, was kind of tired of building it, so he wrote a thing called GitLab CI to do continuous integration. And it was a separate application, and it was written in Ruby, and it was great. It did what it needed to do for GitLab. And then we had an open source contribution come along of this thing called the GitLab runner to run these CI jobs. And it was written in Go, which opened up a lot of doors because, Go can run basically in any architecture. And so now you can run builds in any architecture. Oh, well, that's really interesting. So we took that in and became like kind of the way to run CI jobs. And we actually also hired the person who wrote it. His name's Camille. He's a great guy. And Camille had this argument of like, no, we should make it one application. It should be GitLab, right? It should bring CI integrated in. And Sid, our CEO, and Dimitri said, well, you're wrong, because Unix philosophy, many sharp tools, like they're as integrated as they can be. The APIs are, perfectly in sync. Like, no. And Camille was really persistent, and we ended up doing it. And what we found then were all these emergent benefits, right? Like, I think there's a lot of, kind of general benefits that you can say like, oh, okay, I've got, one tool, I've got less things to deal with. But, this huge emergent benefit of having a single source of truth, having everyone really on the same sheet of music, having really somewhere that non-engineers can get involved and see the developer process, having really some place that centralizes, the security, not only of your application, but of like, what are all the permissions, right? Who has permissions to what, all right? And that's a huge sprawl problem, especially at a large enterprise with many tools. And then just the context switching, right? The little things in context switching, re-authentication, those little slowdowns like add up really, really quickly. And it seems really obvious, but have everything you need at all times makes you more efficient, right? Like, and that's this like very emergent benefit that came. On the other side, we have our general unfair advantage in the market, which is we're open core. And because of that, you get kind of the best of everyone's thoughts on, how to run security. And so you don't just have a company, that may have started in static code analysis and then expanded to the rest of security. Because we say security, but there's really a lot under there, right? There's static code analysis, there's dynamic code analysis, there's, dependencies is a whole thing, right? We're talking about supply chains, like where is stuff coming from? What dependencies are we bringing in to our code base? And those could be ones that come in our code base, or it could be the dependencies in our, what we're building, right? We're all building Docker images nowadays. Well, guess what? Those have multiple layers that are bringing in other dependencies that you're not even thinking about. And so we also take this super wide look at security, being that we kind of, have everything at our disposal. If we're building your code and we have the code, we can do static code analysis and analyze the container that's actually being built, and do a lot more than that. At the same time, being open also allows people to integrate, right? So if you do have that security tool that you love and you can't get rid of, like, okay, integrate it with GitLab. Here's some tools that already do integrate, or here's the JSON spec and just output JSON like this. And now that will come into your merge request, right? And that merge request will still be the central source of truth, even if there's another system involved. And then that merge request becomes the place where you make the go, no go decision about merging something in, right? Does it have all the approvals we need? Does it have all the security checks passed? Is it, ready to go from every team's perspective? And so that, tracking the change that's being worked on and not blocking anyone from having to go look somewhere else to make a decision is really a huge benefit. And the more you adopt, then the more benefits you gain, right? So if you just use GitLab for source code and CI/CD, okay, you already have some benefit, right? You've got this kind of integrated system. But as you start adopting more and more of the system, you see more and more benefits. So you don't necessarily have to go rip everything out tomorrow and replace it with a whole GitLab stack. You can kind of slowly realize more of those benefits.
Gotcha. So it doesn't, if I summarize that up, it's, not only have you guys sort of lived this life, right? It comes out of, kind of shared experience, having grown up with the product and so forth. But, you're not sort of forcing this monolith on folks. You're bringing them sort of incremental things that as they snap together, sort of 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 7 or how it goes, which is a little bit different sometimes than you see people who sort of start with something huge and complete and they go, you should use all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but I don't want one piece of it. You guys come from a different perspective, which I think is very, very interesting. Let me ask kind of a separate question, and we'll kind of get back to a little bit of the market and the things that you're seeing. I mentioned in the top of the show, obviously people saw a lot of news and press about what happened with SolarWinds, and it's still kind of unraveling and kind of we're learning details about it. Has that been a good thing in terms of kind of bringing awareness of the things that you bring value around to people? It's front and center. It's obviously, executives are like, hey, I don't want to be part of those headlines. Do those types of things help in terms of going, hey, this is a real thing, or is it just sort of part of the natural noise of our industry? Do you find?
I think they help. So, I don't know that it helps GitLab per se, but I think it helps us as an industry, right, mature, and kind of raise the water level for everyone when they think about, hey, look, like SolarWinds is this very professional company, hugely successful. The way that this got in was, through kind of typical, supply chains that almost everyone counted on, and so in that sense, I think it helps because it helps make us all more conscious of the supply chain, right? I actually spoke at FOSDEM last month about the SolarWinds hack and just supply chain in general, and I call it strong as your weakest link, right? We call this thing a supply chain for a reason, and that is, it's a chain, and the weakest link in that chain is going to get exploited. And we're going to see more of these kinds of vectors of attack where it comes from, hey, look, like SolarWinds wasn't the target necessarily, right? They were the vehicle to get to the target. And we're going to see more of those kinds of things, right? We've seen, people doing funky things with the NPM registry to sit on, different common names and things. And, we've got to all be really conscious about what comes in the door. We've got this fantastic world of open source that lets us move a lot faster. But it also brings in a lot of supply chain complexity. And that's something I think we all, are learning the lessons. And like you said, no one wants to be that person with the call from the FBI or from Congress to come testify, right? Nobody wants that. The thing I say, and I think that makes the case for this, this DevOps platform, right? Again, does it make the case for GitLab? Sure, a lot of opinion there, but I think it makes this case for this DevOps platform that security cannot be a separate thing. It has to be integrated to the entire life cycle. And I've been saying that for a long time. I think we've all been saying that for a long time, but we've really keep seeing how it can come back to bite you if it's not, right? I mean, we saw it with Equifax, right? This was, the Equifax hack was similar in the sense that it was an open source vulnerability in Struts, Apache Struts, that had been patched by Struts, but sat around for 1.5 years in production. And so you have to have the code base integrated with your dependency management and dependency security tools tightly enough that you can find that, right? Like when Apache Struts, this thing comes out, or SolarWinds, or the next thing comes out, everybody's CEO is going to pick up the phone and call maybe you in the morning because they're watching, they're having their breakfast and watching CNN, watching something break. You don't want to be then trying to figure out, oh, wait, where do we have Apache Struts in our infrastructure? Right. Right. What you want is an integrated tool where you've already read your email before that phone call that says, hey, these are 3 repositories that, have Apache Struts in them. And there was a patch released overnight, and we've created the merge request for you automatically to update. And we've run all your unit tests, and actually we deployed it to Canary in production, and there's no problems, no issues with increased error load. Do you want to go ahead and deploy it everywhere? And you can say yes. So your answer to that phone call is, yeah, we've already deployed the fix, right?
Yep.
And that seems like a crazy, I used to tell that story and say, well, this is what our CEO says, 2 years ago. But I mean, that's the reality. That's what we need.
Right.
That's kind of systems that can help protect, and they have to be integrated, right? Security system has to know what's in the code. Code has to be able to deploy without you worrying about it too much. That all has to happen.
That's right. Making your breakfast that much less stressful day in and day out. Hey, one last question before we wrap up and I let you go. Just, real quick, 2 or 3 things that kind of tips you have for developers or teams that want to get more efficient. What are some of the 2 or 3 things that you're always like, start here, or these things always work? Yeah.
I would say if you don't have continuous delivery, I think everybody has CI. I'm going to make maybe a big assumption, but I'm going to assume that you have the ability to bring your code together and build it with CI. I don't think everybody has reliable CD and deployment that they can rely on. I think I saw a tweet from somebody from JFrog the other day that said, my favorite part about DevOps is how it makes me able to be lazy, right? Like you want to not be SSHing into machines. You want your deploys to be automated completely. And so spend the time now to do that. That's one of those few things that is clearly on the correct side of the graph of how long it takes you to automate versus how much benefit you get from automation. And so I think that's one thing for sure. And then I think the next thing is, get security integrated to that pipeline somehow. And, you won't be able to do everything at once. You won't be able to boil the ocean in a day. But, as much as you can bring in, if it's just static code analysis, right? There's lots of open source static code analysis tools out there. You can obviously do it with GitLab out of the box, but whatever you're using, get some level of security in your pipeline so that you're not at the end of a release cycle every time before you talk about security. I think those are the 2 things.
Good stuff. Brendan O'Leary, thank you so much for the time this afternoon. We appreciate it. It's always good to learn from folks who have been not only living this but have been on the other side of the fence and seen some of the horrors when you don't get it right. So, thank you so much for teaching us a little bit today, folks. With that, we're going to wrap it up. We want to thank Brendan for myself and for Aaron. As always, we thank you for listening to the show. We thank you for telling a friend. Thank you for giving us feedback on Apple Podcasts. Another place where you can give us some ratings and feedback. So with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.